30 seconds until the introduction.
New challenges await us every day. We have hundreds of conversations. We plan, arrange and clarify. We act. And yet, acting separately, we still make different decisions, which affect the quality of our lives and daily surroundings. By building sustainable cities, spaces and buildings, we can create a better future for us and our children. Let's meet to talk about it. Join Future Builders, a dedicated project created for you to share knowledge, inspiration and impulses to build a better future. Let's talk. Sign up today and take part in conversations with world-renowned architects.
Welcome at the next meeting within Future Builders project. My name is Piotr Żabiński and I will today talk about architecture with an excellent architect, Zbigniew Maćków. Buildings, cost of construction, it's only 15% of the total life cycle of the building, whereas about 75% that is cost of its use and refurbishment, repair work. In order to protect the environment, we should pay more attention at keeping lowest possible the energy consumption and asset consumption. This is done by analysis of life cycle cost, which should be obligatorily made at design stage and should be taken into account when selecting among various options of the project for implementation. Today it is not too common an approach, but we should not be saving time and money which can be spent for pre-design analysis of life cycle cost of the building, because a better considered investment project is better for and more neutral for the environment. Let's together work for better future for us and our children with a stress on friendly coexistence between man and environment. Future Builders is a platform of cooperation where architects, urban planners, developers and entrepreneurs cooperate. We may confront our experience with the perspective on sustainable architecture of the future. About these matters and the future of architecture and construction, we have already talked to Robert Konieczny and Przemo Łukasik. Today we will talk to Zbigniew Maćków, and on the 14th of October with Alvaro Leite Cizaveira. One more meeting with Bogdan Zaha is ahead of us, and the time will be presented later. The originator and sponsor of the project Future Builders is Aluprof. Be a part of Future Builders. Let's welcome today's guest, Zbigniew Maćków. Zbigniew Maćków, architect, graduate from Wrocław University of Technology, Department of Architecture. He also studied at Kingston University School of Architecture in London, member of Polish Architects Association, SARP, and member of the Lower Silesian Architectural Chamber, where he held the position of the chairman, currently vice chairman, member of the city urban committee, architectural committee, and his work was nominated many times for awards and awarded in competitions in Poland and abroad. He is honorary laureate of SARP 2020, and he got awarded by SARP for the Building of the Year and honorary award of Wrocław SARP, awards in Life in Architecture and Beautiful Wrocław, and nominated on shortlist for Mies van der Rohe award. Since 1995 he has been running his own design office, Maćków Pracownia Projektowa, and in his portfolio he has numerous buildings, residential, commercial, public utility and industrial ones, and he is among others author of projects like reconstruction of Trade Center Renoma and the 5th Upper High School in Wrocław, and Transfer Junction next to Wrocław Stadium, and Lower Silesian College building, Department of Law, Administration, Economy of Wrocław University, buildings like Thespian Silver Tower Center, and office building at Dubois number 41. Zbyszek, let's talk about the future of architecture. First, there will be a few questions from me, but I encourage the audience to ask questions on the chat, which will be read out in the second part of our conversation. To start with, a question, well, because in one of the interviews earlier you said that architecture should be solving problems and change the world to the better. Is this expressing a priority of aesthetics, of ethics over aesthetics in architecture? What is your opinion in this subject? Well, let me start from thanking you for the invitation. It's a great pleasure to be in such an exclusive, great company of my colleagues, architects, and let's hope also in the later editions. And thank you for preparing this conversation. Yes, really, I keep up this statement that for me and practically us, I like to say us rather than me, because architecture is a team discipline for years, and if you compare it to sports events, and in our list of priorities, such empty meddling with forms is at one of the last positions. I simply don't understand such an attitude. We always try to solve some problem using a project task. Not always it is so simple and obvious, and not always it is 100% in line with the brief, with the order from the investor. By the problem, I don't understand that the building should be solved. I mean, this is our work, but by the way, usually we solve some tasks from outside the investor's list. In most cases, it is, colloquially speaking, urban cleaning up, especially in the context of our city, where various grids overlap from various periods of its dynamic life, and some order has to be brought in it. It's not only this urban aspect, but sometimes it is much more broader thing, and aesthetics or the form is in some sense a result, an outcome from the process of solving this problem. But first we tend to actually do preparation of this problem and to formulate it ourselves in the form of a question we are answering. Well, you actually formulated this beauty slightly different than its classic definition. You once said that new definition of beauty is moderation. We should stop spending money on useless elements and sumptuous facades, and rather than that, we should be doing good functional architecture of the background, simplifying it to load more funds in thickness and durability of walls rather than in aesthetics. But I miss actually popularity of this thought in Polish architecture. But what are other good features of architecture in your opinion? Because we were talking about solving problems. That means about adding some added value on the pure order. But what other good features of architecture you would specify apart from that? Well, I think the area we are involved in has been in place so long that it has been described many a time by those who have more time for thinking, and one of the best definers is Vitruvius, who actually in his Decalogue, which then actually is abbreviated to a commonly known triad, formulates the features of good or best architecture, and without change it remains functionality, durability and beauty. Whereas our task, because we live actually several ages after Vitruvius, so our goal is constant search for travesting or understanding differently those terms and current definitions, and it seems that today to the Vitruvius triad, if we were to refer today's meanings, so I would add moderation to beauty. I mean, I would put it equal durability, well, that sort of durability over time. We should start thinking about buildings as structures which will be standing not only through the lifetime, functional single lifetime, but already we should anticipate the possibility of having more of those lives, and their roles, functions will be changing. So to design buildings in such a way as for the reconstruction for consecutive needs to be possibly smallest and to generate possibly lowest footprint, carbon footprint. And the third, which uses term, results from the second one, I mean readiness for changes. And if I were to define, I would call it flexibility or being ready for hybrid situation. And this is what I would like to refer to, because you are talking of this durability, durable and flexible buildings. You call them hybrids. And which of those buildings of yours implemented by you, which of them you would call hybrids? What features they have, making them possible to be converted in the future once their function, their role changes due to the change in need? What buildings would they be, in your opinion? Well, the paradox actually is based on the fact that we keep exercising this profession in the role being responsive to expectations of our customers, their orders, and as the agenda of our clients does not have, well, we talk of the future actually, as the title says, so we all hope that these issues will appear on the agenda quite soon. But honestly speaking, and I want to speak honestly, in our conditions it's very difficult to find actually clearly progressive features, because the demand for the time being is as it is. But we have the luck to work with the buildings which had been designed by others, great architects. I'm thinking here of Renoma building, so former Wertheim, designed by Hermann Wertburg, which actually has been through the fifth or sixth functional conversion, maybe not so drastic that from commercial it would be changing to residential, but the philosophy is changing so strongly that the building is actually being converted in yet another version of itself, perfectly realizing the commercial features. And now we are in progress of yet another such metamorphosis. The other building is the one we are sitting at. It is a residential building built in former century. Then it became the seat of aristocracy. Then actually it was converted from large flats to small ones because they were split into, into 4 or 6. A few years ago there was a Roma restaurant here. Now there are us, design office. So and soon there will be something else probably. So a building which has been in place for over 100 years is not demolished and reconstructed, but gently the interior is actually being modified, and it is ready for such changes, and changes its roles so drastically without generating excessive carbon footprint. So life is showing actually that this hybrid feature is something what is in place today, and in future, which will be changing more dynamically, will probably be still a more demanded feature of new buildings. Therefore, let us design flexibly and let us think that the object we got an order for today, in 10 years' time, it may be needed for completely different purpose. Also, pandemia showed it, and what was happening with hospitals, how they needed to be flexibly redesigned practically overnight. So let's return to the subject of the city, because you are actually standing up for a dense city. You are actually a founder of Densely think tank. It is not so easy to obtain social acceptance for making the city more, or the town more dense. Sometimes those investment projects densifying cities actually meets a protest of local inhabitants because they are losing, let's say, a grass lawn for their dogs to walk their dogs. So how are you coping with making the town more dense and the public opinion? Well, joking, well, I have had dogs forever, and I tend to avoid building on squares which are used for walking the dogs. But with this density, it's just like with cholesterol. It is not that we are actually implementing the good thing rather than the bad one, but it is extremely a serious problem which demands a very serious discussion with actually strong points, which in my opinion is not going on at all. So thank you for this question. We have to yet another time make ourselves aware that in order to maintain the planet in such shape as we received it and to pass it on to next generations, we must not be hedonistic at the maximum level. We have to actually get out of our comfort zone, and it doesn't mean, of course, that we should be building over every piece of green. Well, we should rather avoid touching the green, but we should talk of sound, healthy density. Well, it's enough to look at our cities. They are totally actually flooded or flowing out. Koszalin has greater surface area than Paris. If we look at Paris, you will say that these are cities where it is not good to live in. But those cities are 3 to 5 times more dense if we talk of density of population compared to Wrocław, for example. And if we are talking of building on green squares, on green areas, it is definitely pathological. Every piece of green, every tree should be maintained. But if we look at the downtown quarters, well, practically there is not too much of those green areas or trees. There are actually wrecked cars given up by people, or dozens of garages with concrete built areas for cars to drive over. And I live in a city which has a simple DNA of German cities, and with the same DNA in an identical quarter in Berlin, there are 3 more lines of buildings. In Paris, if we look at Google Maps, there are 5 rows of buildings on such an area. If a town is not sufficiently dense, everything suffers from it. Public transport, because it's not loaded sufficiently, trams, because they are expensive. Infrastructure suffers from it because the pipelines must be longer to reach out to the suburbs, and the city which is not sufficiently dense is an expensive city. And we cannot afford having expensive cities because we are not Switzerland. And a city which is not sufficiently dense is highly unecological, and we cannot afford it. So let us wisely make cities more dense, and do not let us allow suburbs to spread out excessively. And if we are increasing density, let us do the recycling of space not at the cost of green areas, but at the cost of actually the city unused grounds. Well, I wanted to ask you about WUWA 2 Nowożerniki district, many times awarded, because it was actually thought of as a modern city, a model contemporary residential quarter. And what ecological solutions you applied when designing it, and what other city authorities and developers can peek at over there. Well, it seems that this exercise, which we carried out under the patronage of Mr. Mayor of Wrocław, but under the organizational emblem of Lower Silesian Chamber of Architects and Lower Silesian SARP, Polish Architects Association, it actually showed that the sustainable development is, first of all, in urban planning, not in all these gadgets which we used to be mentioning. I mean, photovoltaic panels and windmills and other inventions. Yes, to some extent too, but if we look at big figures, so then the greatest savings in generating carbon footprint result from urban planning decisions, and there we actually implemented such decisions, and among the greatest ones is to organize that residential quarter, the district, around an urban core, a hub, which is a pedestrian hub, so in a way enforcing all services to be at the ground floor along this axis, which actually would result in us not needing to use our car to drive to get the services, or so we simply go out walking to the greengrocers, to the post office, and thirdly, locating this estate in the district with good cooperation with public transport, which will result in the car being less used. But finally, we applied technical solutions, mainly based on infrastructural decisions. All the district is actually provided with district heating. There is not a single local boiler house there we applied a retention of rainwater stored in two containers. One of them is used for recreation with LED lighting, slowed down traffic. So all the solutions are actually big urban planning decisions, and they actually give most positive outcome. All those elements, of course, are used, like photovoltaic panels and the renewable energy sources installations, but the clue is in urban planning decisions. So here we can only and solely address the city authorities, but also the investors. Choose those locations for your investment projects with great awareness and social responsibility, because actually where the investment project is then implemented and what outcome it will generate over many years of its life cycle, these are most significant results for the environment. From the time perspective, reconciling, watching the long-term implementation of WW2 district, its operation, would you change anything there? Would you today solve something differently? I guess yes, because the world is actually running forward. But how do you today evaluate the operation, the existence of WW2? Well, I will stubbornly be changing saying we rather than I, because this project was actually implemented by actually over 40 design offices organized by SARP, the Polish Architects Association, and we are now before such an evaluation, each of us watching this live, which got installed at that district. Everybody have their own opinions, and I am convinced. I also have my own personal private list, so I'm convinced that we would change many things. But this is what an experiment is based on. I mean, construction of such a district, that life has its own dynamics, and we tend to be catching up with this dynamics and do things flexibly enough so that this district can rectify itself by itself. So to answer this question specifically, well, for sure, the most important thing is completing the place. When I say completing, I mean these two public units, public buildings, which are flanking or ending this pedestrian axis, because these were two nodal points, polar points, which generated the traffic. One is the center of local activities, so cultural center contemporarily, and I think that following declarations by Mr. Mayor, it will be built soon, and the city marketplace, which has been prepared. It's enough to install the roofing and put up the stalls, the stands, where the inhabitants can be actually trading, buying and selling, and then this set will be complete and it will be working. Yet another element is public transport, which will be not only located on the borderline of the district, but it will cross this district. Well, we do count upon that the tram depot, as designed, was to be built a few years ago, but we hope that, based on EU funds, the city will return to this idea, and this place can be still stronger saturated by public transport. The recent news happened to be such that the city won subsidy for a large sports center, city center, which will be there. I mean, roofed playground and football ground and many other things. So many things will be added up to this, and I hope that this district will be a good place to live in. Well, congratulations to the whole super studio, because actually that group of active architects is named this. The result is exceptional, but let us leave this model residential district aside, because I would like to turn a little bit towards and to refer to the program of Polish deal, which instead of the model residential quarters plans a mass-scale construction of typical little houses, detached houses, which will fill this space. How do you evaluate this idea, and what is your approach to it? Well, I will try to be gentle, but I must admit I'm short of words which can describe how much I do not understand this idea, and well, a nonsense way of solving a real and very serious residential crisis in our country. I'm really astonished, because the first diagnosis of the group managing our country initially at the beginning of their first term were very much to the point, were right. Well, there is shortage of a couple 100,000 from 3 to 500,000 available flats. So in order to fill up this demand gap, supply should be provided, speeded up, simplified supply based on repetitive designs, based on typical solutions and prefabricated elements, without losing sustainable development, and provide a possibility of renting rather than ownership, because actually this model will probably be a model dominating for the consecutive generations. This diagnosis was exceptionally right, but operationally in implementation it died out. We will not be analyzing why, because it's not time and place for this, but to the astonishment of not only my humble person, but also all involved people, and well, an idea arises which will not solve the problem. It's hard to imagine 1.5 million detached houses to be built, and it is very harmful, an idea, on many platforms, on the platform of sustainable development, because this is what we discussed a moment ago. This is an idea which is absolutely opposite to anything what is being discussed in architecture today. I mean, in opposition to green sustainable development, to green Bauhaus, we must put it clearly that a detached house is the least ecological way of inhabitation invented by mankind. And of course, well, immediately we will hear opinions. Yes, you can make this house a passive building and wrap it up in dozens of photovoltaic panels and windmills, and it will be zero energy billing. Yes, but we will not change infrastructure. We will not change the fact that if a typical plot has 20 meters of width, so to provide for 100 detached houses, we need 1 kilometer of a road. And assuming that these houses are on two sides of the road, we need 500 meters of the road, 500 meters of sewage pipes and water pipes and power line and so on. And for the to provide for the same 100 families in a block of flats, or in one, it's enough to have the 20, 30, 50 meters instead. So the difference is basic, and the difference is in infrastructure. This is one of the problems, but another problem is absolute desurbanization of this country, which is actually one of the largest in Europe, and it will be only progressing. I mean, about the questions of safety, depreciation of the profession of the architect by excluding responsibility and role of the designer or architect as a profession of public trust. In this aspect, I will avoid mentioning it. It is highly harmful an idea, and I do hope it will not be implemented. Regarding what I understood, you actually point at the fact that it's certain incapability of the authorities actually focused on the project of detached houses for many people. This way, actually throwing the obligations onto the shoulders of the citizens themselves. Do your inhabitation well by yourselves. It is short-sighted, and about this short-sightedness in investing, I would like to ask you another question, because in my opinion it is a big problem which needs to be worked on, that there is a common short-term perspective of investing which actually makes the budget at the stage of construction of the project and not focusing on the costs of exploitation, of using during the whole life cycle of the building. And this anti-environmental approach, well, how do you think, how to fight against it? Because of course, scientific papers tell us that such short-term perspective must not be in place. Even the law on public procurement states during the recent or one of the recent upgrades states that public investment projects must also be analyzed from the perspective of cost of the use of exploitation of the building, and it must be actually the basis for selecting the project for implementation. So what, in your opinion, can be done to focus the private investors or developers onto this more long-term perspective? As always, whip and a stick and a carrot. So in this case, appropriately fiscal and educational activities, and possibly benefits, bonuses resulting from this, or for example tax reliefs resulting from the fact when the building is in the appropriate type limits of energy saving. Well, I will put it like this, because as not realized mathematician, because I used to want to study mathematics and I love the laws of mathematics, and I refer to them in architecture. They organize the world. There are 3 laws, but here we talk of the calculation which can not only be done on exploitation, but also during the end-of-life utilization of the building, and so this calculation must be complete in order to be making right decisions. And I think that this stick, that means fiscalism, taxation for buildings which do not fulfill the requirements, so introduction of variable tax on real estates. I mean, those buildings which would not fulfill the requirements, the tax would be higher, and energy-saving buildings would have much lower taxation. Well, today we have very outdated solutions in place, because in Poland it doesn't pay to save historical buildings, so to give them yet another life in the circular economy, because an old factory which is adapted needed for some needs, tax-wise is still treated as tax base, and tax relief on a historical building is only applicable when the building is not being used. So what pays is to do nothing about it. Once it is returned to next life, the taxes are actually murderous. So here is a great area possibility for action. So we have to make people aware when buying a fridge or a TV set, or we can go to in the shop and check the level of energy saving based on the letters from A through G to H, and choose from this perspective. And soon, even still more, when starting January next year, the bills for electricity will go up terribly. So yes, there should be some certificates. There are energy certificates in place, but they are a completely empty solution, not used in real life, not telling us anything. We should simplify this information quite considerably to a very emblematic symbol, which is telling us how expensive the building will be in use, in its exploitation. And the last point here, there is some hope in reshuffling the market and in the fact that greater and greater role will be played in our landscape by flats for rent managed by funds. So not built by developers who really have a short-term horizon. This is the nature of their business. Similar to the philosophy of a student. Learn and pass the exam and forget. And now the funds have longer horizon, a few or even over a dozen year long. And this, with the cost of exploitation. So may the hope come to life. Meshes investors do analyze also the cost of life cycle of the building during its use. Well, you mentioned once in an interview with Gazeta Wyborcza that you are convinced that we are the last generation building so much and in such dimensions, such size. Generally, I do agree with you, but when I was visiting Asia, there is such an incredible construction boom in place. So isn't it only a perspective for our part of the world, I mean aging Europe, where actually we have quite a lot of assets here, but as we mentioned, we have a very high deficit in flats. So in Poland, the resources do require further construction. But let's look globally at the world. Do you think that really those economies chasing the rest of the world, the leading countries, won't they be the main factor poisoning the planet over the next 50 or 100 years? Well, I think that for sure there is a discussion ahead of us, a global discussion or over continental discussion, because we have, yes, really have a bit different agendas on various continents, different agendas. As you said, if we take into account developmental context, Europe is actually satisfied, full up, with the fat cat, having everything what it needs, having all the stadiums, and there are societies and places globally which aspire to have this infrastructure, and they don't have it. But actually, yet another agenda is overlapping over this agenda, the one for climate changes, that we will start facing climate migrations to a greater scale, and therefore a question arose how big, how much sense is to invest in places which will not be fit for living in very soon. Won't it be the situation that the case that we here in the well-fed Europe that we will have to actually move aside, giving more space for others? And this discussion, well, I'm specifying only two agendas, 2 points in this discussion. There are many more of them. There is energy poverty, water poverty, which will be generating new settlement maps, and it seems that an over-continental discussion is needed here in order to slightly control these processes, to avoid letting a situation when millions of people will start doing it on their own, because we will not manage to cope with it, both those who will be looking for the funds and those who will be defending their positions. So therefore it is a task for the nearest future to discuss and to decide it, and then actually the question of building new infrastructure will be a result, actually an effect of these decisions, because if we assume that the world would remain within the limits it is in, yes, you are right, but there is the whole part of the world which doesn't have this infrastructure, and it should happen there, but other factors tell us that not necessarily so. So let's return to our part of this world, to Europe, and let us talk for a moment about revitalization, because taking care of environmental resources, as we said, we should stop building here so many new buildings, and rather than that, to better utilize the existing ones. And in these revitalizations of the buildings, you also participate. I'm thinking of the historic complex of Maria Mill in Wrocław, but also for your own needs, you are adapting a closed boiler house from Pafawag factory. So tell us about revitalization, because it is not an easy piece of bread in designing. Well, I would dare say the most expensive one, and actually this requires greatest knowledge and experience. But yes, this observation actually is linking us to other ideas. I mean, increasing density in town or the sustainable development, but also with the with the quantity we are going to be building. Well, let's look. We have not been existing that long, but even over the period of our existence of our design office, this year it is already 26, soon will be 27 years old. So I can notice regularity here, that over the first years the projects implemented were 10% compared to newly built, not because we were specializing in it, but simply this is how the market is operating, that actually the available land is in shorter and shorter supply, and everybody see hidden potential in existing buildings, which, for example, have an excellent location, and therefore it only confirms that it is some future, and very good so, because it is action actually directed towards limiting carbon footprint. We will be generating much less energy when adapting the building, although paradoxically it can be more expensive. However, the carbon footprint will be lower. Regarding the boiler house, yes, actually we are doing this project now, and this is one of the experiments we want to do. We want to carry out, well, partly on our own organism. This is an exercise where we want to adapt a building which used to have a different role in the past, It is a post-industrial unit, not necessarily most interesting one in this town, built after the Second World War, just by the way, with a strongly defined technology inside, indoors, and nothing extraordinary, nothing strange would be in it. It is quite common story, but we want to do it with the use of minimum amount of unnecessary financial input to pay for things which are not necessary. Things which are not necessary are those which generate carbon footprint by their production or transport and do not have an input in, or they are not necessary, those buildings. Or putting it differently, more briefly, being in that building and operating in it, we also want to get out of our comfort zone and not necessarily, well, not use, for sure, not use air conditioning there and reduce ventilation to the minimum. Well, simply we want to operate in such a way. We want to harness thermodynamics to the building, natural processes occurring when temperature outdoors is higher, indoors is lower, and it only needs facilitating the transfer. I mean, open the windows to air the building. So natural ventilation rather than mechanical one, lack of air conditioning. And what about heating? What will you be doing in your boiler house? Well, now we are working on it, and for sure, well, of course, it would be ideal if we could. We would most readily avoid that heating to be installed, but some kind of we will have to install, but it will be advanced in such a minimum extent as it's only possible, colloquially speaking, or giving a picture of it. So if we feel cold, we will wear a pullover. If we feel hot, we will be opening windows and airing the rooms. We want, I believe that we as mankind have moved too far in order to, in our building of comfort zone at the cost of nature, at the cost of climate, and we have to get out of this comfort zone a little bit and learn to operate in this slightly lower, equally good for us atmosphere. It needs getting used to it. When are you going to open up this new office? Well, I hope next year, in the second half of next year. For the time being, we are building it. We are slightly like a laboratory doctor who is trying to test a mixture, a preparation without any governmental programs available, doing it based on own funds organically, and also in a way, in a sustainable way, and therefore there are no plans like this that we will have to cut the ribbon at a certain date because something. But I do count upon you doing it soon, fast, because through your office you will be educating clients who will approach you, and you will be telling them, giving this example, look, it is possible without air conditioning, but you must apply a slightly different approach to certain topics, issues. It is possible to naturally ventilate buildings. So it seems to me that it will be an excellent place, which I do wish you, and also for it to play such a role of education facility for investors. Well, please tell me, because you are criticizing the primacy of property rights over other rights. So how do you think, what planning and fiscal tools, well, we discussed them a little bit earlier, what, which of them should be applied in order to balance the interest of property, to balance it with public interest? Because we have an investor who has a land plot and who wants to build on it. He has the right to build there, but that investor is somehow interfering with the public sphere. So how to balance the interests for us all to be living a better life and still to maintain the environment in a state which is not worsened? Well, so perhaps I do not fully criticize the primacy of property rights. I criticize lack of understanding in those who should understand this. I mean, in authorities of cities or states, because the rules, these rules are building and bringing order into our world, and I am really far away from calling for some anarchy. Of course, these rules can be subject to change, to modification, but in such a way, I mean, you do it slowly with full social agreement and social approval, whereas for the time being we have it as it is, and we should respect it, but we should also understand it. And now, moving on to the example, we must not be complaining in our cities that we have, for example, a dead commercial street, if earlier the same town privatized all the premises at the ground floor, because we cannot blame a new private owner willing or being more ready to rent the place for a bank or mobile network, because rather than having a bookshop or a cafe there or some function which for us as the city dwellers would be actually of more interest. So if we realize that here the ownership, the property rights have some importance, so we have to understand the rules and then in conclusion play along these rules, or leave the ground floors for the disposal of the cities, and then from the rent level to regulate the mix of those who are coming to rent the premises. So manage it like large companies manage actually commercial galleries, and those learned how to organize the spaces, the public spaces indoors, following the example of best European cities, and now they should set an example for towns who got lost in this process. Well, there is a manager in such a shopping arcade, well, next to a shop selling clothes. You are not locating greengrocers. So good spaces, good areas in the city should be managed by someone, and there are two tools, either ownership or fiscal approach, tax approach. So of course we can return to the discussion to regulate by taxes. So for example, to set lower taxes on bookshops and bank offices, higher tax. But it makes our system very complex and difficult to understand. I think property ownership is more simple and it's easier to manage. Well, an example which actually, well, I mean, Przemo Łukasik, Medusa in Krakow, excellent residential quarter, live in the city, where a developer who built it sold the ground floor compartments, although all flats are sold. Well, the developer is managing the ground floors selecting the mix of users by the level of rent. So if he wants, for example, to have a flower shop in the the shopping arcade. So he establishes such a level of rent which will allow a flower shop to operate in that place, being satisfied with lower income, but having satisfied inhabitants in that street and some image success of their investment there. And this is how cities should be operating. So wrapping up, long-term thinking, yes, for sure, long-term thinking, exactly, and multi-aspect one. Cities must not abdicate from their role of the actually leading player. They must not manually control everything, but they must moderate these processes. Well, you say that we are herd creatures and that the pandemics showed how we are missing the interpersonal relations when we were locked in our houses by limitations. I wanted to refer to it because if we are to improve the world, then the human herd must be running in the same direction, whereas we are living in a highly atomized world. So do you think that we as people are, or we tend to give up some of our interests, small personal opinions, and give up the comfort zone and aim at implementation of this little utopia of a vision of friendly cohabitation between man and the nature, because we are aware of the fact that actually man has did annexation of nature. Well, is there any hope? Well, hope is what we should have, but it will not be easy. And talking of mankind, we are actually raising the bar really high. I think we should first do it at the scale of towns and states, countries, regions, and here the most important is the role of education here. Such education like the one which is done by your initiative, which I thank you for. I mean, spreading some ideas and actually overcoming certain myths. We have to be introducing this education system-wise. I'm not only talking of going deep into the schools. Yes, of course, let the chamber do it, but we have to even start from our own area, our own little field. And here we have to get out of our comfort zones. If the Austrian Association of Architects, I guess 3 or 4 years ago, stopped giving architectural awards for detached houses, it's not that they were cross with somebody building such a house. No, simply awards are aimed at promoting certain solutions. Okay, we have really beautiful. Well, I love a few guys in Austria who are doing beautiful, excellent houses. I often watch them, but back to mathematics. We are talking of big figures. So, okay, 1, 2, or 5 beautiful houses will be established, but at the meta scale, where we are to control social behaviors, we have to send a signal that detached houses are not the best idea for sustainable development. That's why they stopped awarding these. And this is a small example, just the first example of acting even within our profession, communicating something, telling people something. A moment ago here we discussed a governmental program, the Polish deal, promoting again something which is actually 180 degrees in a different direction compared to the agenda being implemented by the EU and which should be implemented by the whole mankind. So therefore we should first, just like before, well, actually going to some important battle, we should coordinate our clocks, watches. So we should eliminate certain spheres from social life and then transfer it very consequently onto individual layers of education and also promotion. And you find time to get socially involved in your activities at the Chamber of Architects and your activities in SARP, Association of Polish Architects. This is this element of social involvement, which is not popular among young people. So how would you encourage young architects to do something good together? Well, my role, my situation is easier because I have it in my genes. I remember you were a Boy Scout. Yes, I was a Boy Scout. I was everything, but whatever it was possible to be as a kid. But I always remember that my parents actually ran various committees at home, like the committee for water supply system, pipelines to be built, and many other ones. I remember it from home, so it is in my genes. But responding the question, which is very important, well, again, we have to answer about the law of big figures. The world can be pushed forward only by group activities, by synergy, through synergy. No individual design, even most beautiful one, the one which will get all awards in the macro scale, its influence is really tiny. Only through building such added values, the city itself, that means the creation, artificial creation we live in, is one huge mathematical synergy where 1 + 1 equals not 2, but 4 or 5. And also environmentally, we have to create such synergies. And yes, on everyday basis, we should focus on design projects because we have to live on something. But to change awareness, to change understanding what is significant, we can only do it in group activities and influencing by groups. I have not used all questions I had for you to answer, but here we have quite a lot of questions from the audience, and I would really very much like part of those questions to be satisfied, so that you answer them. So now I will take the opportunity to read those questions. Janek is asking, well, Zbigniew, how to now fight against concrete flooding? Well, like Nowy Targ, which is inclusive and good, and well, how to fight against the concrete suppression? Well, again, we have to actually remove magic from slogans. I do not like the slogans like betanoza, that is like concreting the ground, or pato development. Well, they suggest pato herd in one direction. We must say one thing: a square in the city is intended to be a place for gathering, for people gathering. The main role of the square is their plain with elements where you can sit and cool down. It would be good if green appeared in those squares, more and more green, but we have to keep one thing in mind. It is a quotation from Marcin Brataniec, from whom I'm stealing it now. I do apologize. neither a forest is a city, nor a city can ever be a forest. We must not exaggerate, because the square, the new market square, Nowy Targ, if it was covered with green, it would stop being a square and it would become a park. But if I remember well, it's good that a cool element in town among those islands of heat is necessary. Not always it is possible. And let me give you an example. The Nowy Targ office building, about to Skanska company, to the investor, we insisted stubbornly that along the street and the main facade we would plant trees in the cross-section of the street. Of course, for the first time from the Second World War. Trees used to be planted, but trees growing on the networks directly, and we managed to plant 5 beautiful, good sycamore trees, but architects from our investor's office were there, so the amount of time and energy was so huge that it would be enough to design a new building. It took us 1.5 years to convince all decision makers to finally accept planting those trees there. So back to awareness. We have to be changing this awareness in everybody, also in those who are managing. We must actually admit that trees may grow on networks. There are technical solutions which can actually protect networks from tree roots. Adam Liwiński is asking, are there efficient methods for recycling glazed office buildings following the regulations regarding changes in those buildings in the future? Well, I guess the point is that we are living in a space where the glazed office buildings are in great supply, and what to do with them, because those glazed facades are not quite best prone for effective energy management in the period of use, but also to all functions. This is a very good question. I think that, I know that in more developed countries there are already complete programs existing to analyze it and then to modify it. We are still all the time even before the conclusion that something will have to be done about it, because we keep building curtain walls all the time. But unfortunately, it is one of the byproducts of modernism, which at the end of this process actually brought more evil than benefit. The light actually partitions that the structure is separated from the partitions, so you can actually dress the building in various dresses, clothes. They generate big carbon footprint, and then they are not very effective in use. But after, at modernization or reconstruction, greatest amount of waste comes from the glazed facades or partition walls. This is one of the challenges which should be at the peak of our agenda, and now at the top of it. And now we should focus, that durability we mentioned at the beginning of our discussion is also based on durability of the facades, so that the facades are actually resistant to changing the role of the building, so that behind the facade, later on there may be a flat or a hotel or a hospital whatever is needed in town. So Elżbieta asks, first of all, for thanking for you saving the house of Witold Lipiński. What are your plans for refurbishment, and when there will be a possibility to see the indoors of that building? Well, a good question. The house is actually in progress of revitalization. We had to start it because already some quite serious cracking took place there and leakages, and we had to start literally in emergency way. So and save it. It is in revitalization now, and possibility to see it will be exactly this weekend. Sorry for locating the product, but SARP Wrocław awarded Professor Lipiński with Wrocław SARP Award, and this Friday an exhibition will be organized and open up this weekend at Professor Lipiński's house, and on Saturday or Sunday I guess there will be 4 trips which I will have the pleasure, together with my partner Agata, to guide and to tell about the house, whatever we know about it, and concluded on Sunday. And I suggest you visit the Wrocław SARP web page. Well, so we do invite everybody to this, and we don't have time to ask further questions, but if you visit Professor Lipiński's house on Saturday, you will be able... is it on Saturday or Sunday? Both Saturday and Sunday. 2 trips on Saturday, 2 trips on Sunday, and on Sunday, on top of it, as dessert, a discussion among architects. Well, please be invited, and that will be an opportunity for you to ask Zbyszek questions, and I'm sure he will not say no, and he will give answers. In the meantime, I thank you, Zbyszek, very much for our conversation. You, dear ladies and gentlemen, for listening, for participating in this discussion. Already today, let me invite you to the next meeting from this cycle, already a week from now, and see you again. Thank you. Let us change the world to the better. I also wanted to thank you. I would like to thank the organizers, especially Aluprof company. It is an excellent idea and excellent initiative. Thank you, Piotr, for moderating it, for having prepared it, and thank you, ladies and gentlemen, that you were ready to actually devote your 1 hour.